Today, we've got a listener question from an officer in Canada who was asking about the Perimeter Group Supervisor. And his question was basically, where is the best spot for the Perimeter Group Supervisor to set up and why? And it turns out it's a little bit complicated. Stick around. That's today's topic. Welcome to the Active Shooter Incident Management Podcast. My name is Bill Godfrey, your podcast host. I am joined by two of my fellow instructors here at the National Center for Integrated Emergency Response. I got retired Assistant Chief Kevin Nichols with us in the house. Kevin, good to have you back.
Glad to be here.
And then we've also got the inimitable Sheriff Kevin Beary, retired as well, in the house. Sheriff, good to have you.
Absolutely good to be here, Bill.
So we got an email from a police officer in Canada that was asking about the Perimeter Group Supervisor. And he says, I have a question regarding the role of Perimeter Group Supervisor when working for a large department with significant resources. I understand that Perimeter Group typically switches to a separate channel for communications. In your experience, where do you generally recommend the Perimeter Group Supervisor position themselves? Would you suggest that they're in the command post with tactical? Or is it more effective for them to remain closer to the perimeter that they're actually controlling? So that's our topic, and it turns out this one, not quite so clear-cut. Kevin, why don't you start us off?
Well, again, your favorite comment to hear from an instructor is, it depends, right? And it really does. It depends on where you're at in the response, how many resources you have on scene, and who that Perimeter Group Supervisor is. I think initially he talks about, do you want him at the command post? Do you want him on site on the perimeter, or do you want him with tactical? I think we could probably take him being with tactical off the table because he's coordinating the perimeter outside of the warm zone, and tactical is really focused on that inside the warm zone. We don't want him in the warm zone where tactical is going to be to try to gum up that response. The other two are both viable options, and it really comes down to what you have in front of you, what you're looking at, and what's better. Early on or with a smaller response, he might need to take a position on the perimeter. So you would assign him to the perimeter to run that group and pull double duty as both a perimeter position and a group supervisor. Later on, or with a larger response, having him in the command post has a lot of benefits as well.
I totally agree with what Kevin just said, especially when it comes to the point where if he can be at the command post, that is where he needs to be, because that'll get the information that is ongoing, potential suspects in the wind, there's a foot pursuit, the subject's leaving the area. You can get that information immediately out to your perimeter people so that they can deal with it.
Which kind of creates an interesting thing that I think, there's two things there I think we need to dive into a little bit and talk about. So in the early response, we're advocating for a Perimeter Group Supervisor and a perimeter group to be stood up and organized pretty fast into this response. And in that early few minutes, like you said, Kevin, that Perimeter Group Supervisor is probably going to be doing two things. They're going to be coordinating the perimeter, and they're going to be standing a post. But at some point, as you get additional resources and they begin to fill that perimeter out, where is the best position for him? Now, our listener asked about the radio channels and said, I understand that perimeter normally moves to a separate radio channel, and that's true. What that does, though, is it means if the Perimeter Group Supervisor is standing a post and he's not in the command post, somebody in the command post has got two radios. They got the radio that they're listening and talking to tactical on, and they've got the radio that they're listening and communicating with perimeter on. And if you get the Perimeter Group Supervisor to the command post, we now eliminate one of those radio relays and get face-to-face. How much of Sheriff, you work in the command post doing the training a lot. How much of a big deal is that to take one of those two radios away from the law enforcement guy or gal in the command post so that they just have a person to talk to?
Well, I think it totally cuts down on miscommunication. I think that's the key. Get the vital information out to the perimeter as needed, and if you can reduce that and make it more efficient, that's one of your objectives at that command post and that Perimeter Group Supervisor.
I think we all agree that face-to-face communication is the best. Human interaction, that being able to look you in the eye and understand exactly what you're trying to tell me is absolutely the best option. So if we have the manpower and we're far enough into the response to have that person in the command post, I agree 100%. That's probably where he needs to be. But like we said early on, it might not even be a supervisor. It might be, a ordained supervisor, somebody with stripes on their sleeves. It may be a patrol officer who got put into a supervisory position to run that group until we get enough supervisors on the scene to run it.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's assume that, okay, yeah, we've got 4 or 5 patrol officers that are the first to be detailed to get an inner perimeter started, right? And the perimeter group supervisor is one of those officers who's going to be standing at a post, and it's a line officer. How do you accomplish the transition of having someone else, presumably another law enforcement supervisor, take over that role from the perimeter group supervisor that's in the field, that's just a line patrol officer, and pass that off without disrupting things? What does that look like? What does that sound like?
Well, the most important thing that we always stress, and any time you take over any position in the training, is you got to get an initial briefing. And that initial briefing can come from that slick sleeve deputy or regular patrol officer. He or she gives that briefing, briefs the perimeter group supervisor, and then let the perimeter group supervisor take it from there.
So, Kevin, what does that transition look like when you've got your initial perimeter group supervisor who's standing a post and as the sheriff said, is a slick sleeve, and you actually have someone else, another law enforcement supervisor, is going to take over the role? What does that look like?
Well, like the sheriff said, the important thing is getting that brief. I need to have a really good situational awareness on where everybody is, what their assignments are, and what they've accomplished up to this point, and to be able to coordinate that with your IC, your staff in the IC, whether that's the law enforcement branch or the incident commander.
So if I'm hearing what you guys are saying, that the decision on whether your perimeter group supervisor is standing a post in the field or whether they're standing in the command post is largely a factor of available resources and the time into the incident, timing in the incident?
And I think those two are coordinated. The longer the incident goes, the more resources you're going to have. If you have a large response right early on, if you have, 50 people show up initially on, I've got enough people to staff everything I need to staff, then maybe I have somebody in the command post early on. I think the time into the incident is correlated with how many resources I'm going to have there.
And that also gives that, perimeter group supervisor, if the situation calls for more people on the perimeter, he's got a good hold on it, and he can get the resources and work with the incident commander to get those additional perimeter resources so they can expand their operation.
So an example of that we saw in a couple incidents that were school incidents where there were problems at the outer perimeter, crowd problems with parents, problems with bystanders. In that kind of an incident, how big is your perimeter team going to be? How many officers are going to be assigned to perimeter duty to really secure and isolate a campus on the outer perimeter?
I like what Kevin says. It all depends, but it depends on the situation. If you've got a large group of parents and they're not unruly, you might be able to hold down the numbers. But if you've got a situation where they're not cooperating, you're going to have to get additional resources. And that means that incident commander might have to call for mutual aid and things like that to build that outer perimeter up.
How large your inner perimeter is, how large your outer perimeter is going to be a factor in that. How many people do I need to effectively lock that down? If I'm locking down one building, I'm going to have maybe a smaller group. If I'm locking down an entire, like a university campus, that might be much larger. And then how much interference am I getting from the crowd that I'm trying to hold out with the outer perimeter is going to also affect that. So again, situationally dependent.
All right. Good stuff. Now for his follow-up question, because as we traded emails back and forth, he had a couple of additional questions. He says, okay, if resources are scarce during the onset of the incident and you first establish an inner perimeter with the supervisor standing in one of the positions doing double duty, would that make it difficult to organize and track the outer perimeter as resources trickle in as you get them into staging and you get more resources that are becoming available and getting assigned to staging, or assigned to perimeter? Would you recommend that the supervisor be replaced on the inner perimeter so that they can reposition to the command post or perhaps the outer perimeter?
If you have the manpower available, I think the best answer is to have that person redeploy to the command post or either redeploy to the command post or, like we talked about, have somebody come to the command post to take over for them. It's going to be really difficult. A lot of people talk about how great multitaskers they are, and I think studies show that you can't really multitask. It just means you're doing two jobs at 50% instead of doing one job at 100%. And I think the idea there is having somebody who can sit and watch that while you're standing the post is important. I think that's the better answer, is to have somebody leave you in your place, relieve you of the responsibilities of having to run the inner and outer perimeter, and let you continue holding that post.
And Bill, I'd say if they are truly a supervisor on the perimeter and you get additional resources there, they know how to lead, they know how to make those decisions. Get them back to the command post and let them run the perimeter the way they know how to run it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. So it's kind of comes down to who is your perimeter group supervisor standing the post. If it's a line officer, you probably want to look for a supervisor to actually plug in that role and take over for him. But if it happened to work out that you had a sergeant or a lieutenant who just ended up being there at that time when that job was needed and he's standing a post, maybe it does make sense for a line officer to replace them and for them to move themselves to the command post. The part about moving from the inner perimeter post to an outer perimeter post, I think, is kind of a non-starter. I think if you're going to make that move, make the move to the command post. Would you guys agree?
Absolutely.
I do too. I agree.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this one? I mean, it was an interesting question, and we loved getting some questions from our friends up north,
especially from Canada. Right, that was great. I think the thing to remember, again, you want to kind of be cognizant of your span of control. You get that 5 to 7. We talked about how large the inner and outer might be. You might end up having an inner perimeter group supervisor and an outer perimeter group supervisor reporting to somebody else higher up. That's something you can work out on the day, but just being aware of that and not overwhelming yourself.
And I would say I agree with Kevin on that, because you've got to know what's going on the scene, and you need to make those decisions. And is everything 100% written down on any checklist or anything? Bottom line is you're going to have to make some decisions, and what works best for you and your incident commander.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. The one insight I think I would add from years in the fire service, not in law enforcement, is you do have to kind of be mindful of your span of control. And I realize that the ICS doctrine says 3 to 7 is 5 is optimal. That's a very abstract academic way to look at it. Your span of control and your ability to have a large or a small span of control is impacted by several things. Number one, how experienced are you in managing multiple people? And an experienced seasoned incident commander or somebody that's got experience in incident management teams is going to be capable of having and effectively managing a larger span of control. Somebody who's new to it, like a line officer, they may be overwhelmed past 3. So the notion that they can magically go up to 7 because it's written in some doctrine is foolishness. The other thing that impacts that is the criticality and the speed with which things are changing. So even a seasoned manager, if things are moving fast and changing rapidly, your ability to manage span of control decreases. And so I think you've got to kind of take that in mind.
I agree with that.
In most instances, and tell me if I've got this wrong, in most instances, perimeters, once you get them established, are fairly stable and not terribly fast moving or changing.
At least that's the hope, right? You don't want your perimeter to be giving you problems. So yes, for the most part, yes.
I would agree with that, but I would also say, with the changing times of what's going on the street these days, where they're doing takeovers and chaos, your perimeter groups may end up being much larger than you expected. And that's something that all of us in law enforcement and all the, emergency response, different sections and units, we got to start thinking about that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in the scenario you were given earlier, Sheriff, of the school, if you're having some difficulty with parents or with bystanders, and you're having to really pump up that outer perimeter team and it's problematic, you probably want to get somebody else in and start splitting up some duties and subdividing that down. Here's my guidance to folks just generally, no matter where you land in position. When you get to the point where someone can't have a conversation with you because you're so busy listening or talking on the radio and you're on the phone and you can't write on the board, you're overloaded. It's time to subdivide. You need somebody to help you. Now, that help might just be an aide that's going to talk on the radio so that you can get the radio out of your hands. And frankly, that's one of the easiest ways to solve that overload problem. You're still making the decisions. You just put somebody else on the radio. And so I think that would be my guidance. Have you guys got any other insightful tips specific to perimeter or more generalized on when to recognize your span of control's out of whack or you're overloaded?
Well, I think the one thing, everybody wants to be a contact team. And if you get assigned a perimeter, that is a very important function. And realize that function may take you to additional suspects. So don't sit there and whine about it and have a pity party or anything like that. The bottom line, that's an important position.
I agree. There have been several instances after action reports where information from or officers on the perimeter have solved the problem. So it's not an unimportant position, and it's critical to the success of the outcome.
I would also add that we've had 2 complex coordinated attacks in this country where the suspects were in the crowd around the outer perimeter at one point. And so it is a very important job.
Absolutely.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in and talking about this one. I appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you ever have any questions, we love getting those. You can send them to us at info, I-N-F-O, at 𝗤3pathways.com. So info at 𝗤3pathways.com. Thank you to our producer, Carla Torres, and until next time, stay safe.